Goodreads, and it looks like it's time to review yet another relatively obscure fantasy novel because I'm such a hipster. And the fantasy novel we're looking at today is called The King of Elfland's Daughter by Lord Dunsany. Lord Dunsany is considered a very influential fantasy author. He used to write a ton of short stories and novels and plays in like the early 1900s. And he's seen as a big influence on J.R.R. Tolkien, Neil Gaiman, H.P. Lovecraft, and more. And The King of Elfland's Daughter is considered like one of his best known stories. It's very much like a fairy tale in the sense that it has a very straightforward premise. The king, or the Lord of Earl, is approached by his parliament who wants to introduce some magic into the bloodline. So he gets his son Alveric to venture into Elfland, where he wants him to bring back the King of Elfland's daughter and marry her. So in this world, our world is referred to as the Fields We Know, and then Elfland is this magical world that you can enter by stepping through the boundary of twilight when you go to the east. So Elfland is sort of immortal, it's unchanging, it's untouched by human interference. So you get the sense that the Fields We Know and Elfland are like these two competing frontiers, with the Fields We Know being like the natural world that's been sort of conquered and cultivated by humans, whereas Elfland is like this deep, mysterious, untamed wilderness. And throughout the story, the tension between these two frontiers evolves as the events unfold. Alveric's initial quest to marry Princess Lyrizel is very brief. It only lasts like a few chapters. And from there, we're left to deal with the consequences of their intermingling as the balance between Elfland and the Fields We Know is thrown off. Things start to spill between the two worlds. A lot of the magic starts to affect the Fields We Know, and you realize very quickly that this is a plot-driven novel rather than a character-driven one. The characters are extremely flat. Lyrizel, all she does is like sigh wistfully and sit on her father's lap. So it's very basic, but at the same time, you're kind of swept away by the quaintness and the charm of it, and the story is sort of this gradually unfolding thing, so you never quite know where it's going to go. And although that sometimes makes it feel a little bit thin, it also gives it this air of mystery where you're like, what's going to happen next? One of my favorite aspects of the unfolding plot is how your feelings toward Elfland shift as you read. Like, at first it's sold to you as any other magical world in a fantasy novel. It's like Narnia or Wonderland or whatever. But gradually it takes on this very sinister vibe. The people that live near the border to Elfland refuse to talk about it. They're scared to even look in its general direction. There's like this border gap between the Fields We Know and Elfland, and it's completely desolate. There's no life at all, and as you're wandering through it, you hear like these faint voices on the wind. And then people who visit Elfland and come back have like this deep obsession planted in their brain that like starts to grow in them, like they can't stop thinking about Elfland. You can definitely see how Lord Dunsany influenced H.P. Lovecraft as well, because you've got this sort of like creepy magical world that sort of underpins our world, and sometimes a little snatch of it will come through. There's also this scene that really reminded me of the scene of the dead marshes in The Lord of the Rings. At some points reading this story, it can feel a little bit thin or a little bit overly simplistic, but there's a lot of thematic thought going on just beneath the surface. Elfland is very clearly some kind of metaphor for the afterlife or the end of life. You know, you slowly become familiar with the way that it changes everything that it touches. A lot of people are afraid to acknowledge it or even talk about it, and even Alveric, who is initially brave and he faces it head on, as he ages, he becomes increasingly unnerved by it, especially since somebody goes over Elfland and doesn't come back. And at one point, a troll from Elfland does come to the Fields We Know, and we get a whole chapter that just ruminates on the change that happens in the Fields We Know. Like, everything is either in a state of rebirth or growing or in a state of decay. Dunsany ties mortality to the power of nature. It's something we can't control, it's something beyond our understanding, and it scares us, but in the end it's inevitable for all of us. And the story, a lot of the story beats end up getting completely discarded in favor of that theme of mortality that Dunsany is grappling with. Because most of the story takes place in early medieval England, you inevitably get a lot of references to Christianity and its own answer for mortality. And there are a few points in the book where there's like this pagan-Christian tension, like when Alveric and Lyrazel start to realize that they have very different outlooks when it comes to spirituality. But for the most part, Dunsany doesn't let the religious tension take over the narrative, and instead focuses most of his time just sort of expounding on the uncanny beauty of Elfland. He uses this incredibly flowery prose that is really transporting. What's unique about Dunsany's approach when it comes to his fantasy world is that he spends 90% of his story in the fields that we know. So Elfland is mostly felt but not seen, and I think it's a great approach in making sure that his world feels otherworldly and mysterious like it should. But I think that there are points where he gets lost in the sauce of lovingly describing his own scenario, and he sacrifices some other elements of the story to do so. Like, the latter half of this book is taken up by chapters that just sort of ruminate on the story he's built up. And while a lot of it is very beautiful and it has a thematic reason to be there, I think it ends up discarding a lot of the story, and it ends up feeling just very meandering. Like, there's all these story threads that are kind of competing and being built up as the story goes, but when you hit the end, they're just cut off so clean that you're like, what? That kind of throws away some of the purpose of what we've been following, you know? And I think the characters could have been built up as well in a better way. Like, I know that he's building from simple archetypes, and that's fine, but one of his core themes in this book is things like loss and grief, and a lot of those things would have struck a lot harder if they had been rooted in characters that were a little bit more fleshed out. I learned after I read this book that Dunsany never rewrote anything that he put down. He always just published his first draft, and while that's impressive when you consider how beautiful his language is and how he crafts his themes, sometimes it's a little bit too apparent that he rushed this out in a single draft when it comes to the character and story. On one hand, I really enjoyed this book for its haunting atmosphere, its beautiful prose, and the thematic meditation on life and death. It's a really cozy read, it's a very subdued story, like it's not going to knock your socks off or anything. On the other hand, I couldn't help but notice the flaws. It feels very thinly realized in some places. The writing definitely needed a little bit more fleshing out and finessing and refining. So at the end of the day, I come down at like 6.5 out of 10. And that's not to dismiss this book by any means. I'm really glad that I read it, and I would recommend that you read it as well, especially if you're interested in the forerunners of fantasy that preceded and inspired the bigger works that came later. If you've read this book, or any other books by Lord Dunsany, or old fantasy, I would love to hear your recommendations and your thoughts on it, so let me know. But yeah, that'll have to do it for me for this time. I don't know when I'll be back, but I will be back, so thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.